Okay. That should be happening. All right. It is up in all of its compressed audio glory. Probably how you all hear me right now anyway. Yeah, I guess I'll start the recording, and whoever people could filter in as necessary. So here we go. All right, short and sweet this time. Hi everyone, thank you for coming to the second of the Space Underground Q1 lunchtime talks. I'm James DeCorsia. Most of you know me, and those of you who don't know me definitely know Brian. Brian has had a storied career across a number of recognizable programs, including Human Landing System (HLS), excuse me, and the Mars mission, and MRO as well. And his background is in systems engineering and software, flight software development. That's how he supported those programs and continues to support others. So I figured there isn't anyone better that I know to talk about requirements management. And it's a really important subject to both him and I right now, and hopefully to those of you in attendance or who are watching this recording later. Speaking of the recording, there's actually a live stream going on YouTube right now. If you're watching on YouTube, you are viewing this video through the lens of YouTube into our Discord channel. Reach out to myself on LinkedIn or Brian or anyone in attendance, and we'll be able to get you an invite to the Discord server. So without further ado, take it away, Brian.
Thanks, James. So yeah, I'm really excited to be here. I am very passionate about requirements and system engineering. Just to give a really short intro of myself, as you mentioned, James, I think most of the folks here know me, but I've worked in system architecture, lifecycle system engineering, everything from proposals to initial requirements receipt from customers and management of that set of requirements, the whole requirements and tasking toolchain management, flight ops, flight and test software, multiple levels of involvement, all the way from individual contributor to management to some kind of a blended mixture. I've done LEO missions and GEO missions and lunar missions and interplanetary missions. I've got a couple spacecraft at Mars right now, bringing back scientific information. I've heard what James said. It's the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter and the Emirates Mars mission. I've got one at GEO. I've got GOES bringing back weather information. So I've done some stuff. And all of those things are, at least in my experience, fundamentally starting from a system engineering perspective, a requirements perspective. And so I wanted to talk about that and really talk about what are requirements as a starting point. And you're going to get different opinions from different folks. So I try to simplify things. Requirements push formality. They push control. They push specific sets of attributes that we know we care about when we're putting together needs on a program. We have people defining them in very different ways. Some of that is people want to say they want formality in their English language. A requirement is a shall statement. Some people want to say it's a use case. Some people want to say it's a user story. Ultimately, requirements are a tool. That's it. They're just a tool. It's a way to say we need to do a thing. And it's a thing that we want to track formally. It's a thing that we want to have configuration management wrapped around. It's a thing that our customer needs in some way. But really, what requirements are a symptom. And they're a symptom of a program or an organization's system engineering. And that's good or bad. So when we talk about requirements, the way that I like to think about this, there needs to be some kind of philosophy. We need to have a documented way that we want to approach requirements. We need to write it down so that not only the folks that are working on the program, but folks that are new to the program. When we have people from another part of the organization that join us, when we have people that are external to the organization that we're trying to explain what we're doing, we want to have this written down, and we want to be able to point to it, and we want to be able to say, we're all doing this. That approach needs to stem directly from the way we do systems engineering. And so what we want to try to do is emphasize things like simplicity. We want to emphasize cohesion. We want an approach that fits into the overall system engineering approach that we're putting together to drive mission success. So when we start talking about requirements, what we start with is what's our philosophy here? And so the philosophy is these kind of simplicity-focused items. They're things like, okay, I want to make sure I'm thinking of my life cycle. I don't want to do the thing right this second. That's the easiest thing this second, if that's going to make it harder for us later. And so that's where we're trying to get to. But we can go and we can elaborate this philosophy. We write it down. That philosophy leads us to a framework, and that framework's based on these foundational ideas and approaches, and that provides our consistency for the team. So that's really, really, really helpful. Because now we've got a whole group of folks that are all kind of moving in the same direction. And that's the starting point. That's kind of foundational. That's number one. But consistency isn't really enough for us, is it? Because I think everyone on this call has seen consistently bad requirements. And so what's happened over the last X number of years in the industry that's kind of gotten us here? We've seen some large programs that have employed large numbers of folks that haven't had this base philosophy. They haven't written it down. They haven't had anyone kind of leading the charge. And so it turns into a whole bunch of very point solutions that you end up trying to talk to somebody and they say, well, in this one case, I think we should do this. In this other one case, I think we should do this other thing. That's fine, but it's not going to get you a consistent approach. It's not going to get you a consistent set of requirements, and it's not going to lead future you to have an easier time because it's not following this set of known things that their lessons learned, their best practices. Some of those are even documented at certain organizations, and they still don't get followed. So what is it that we do? How do we make requirements consistently good? And I think there's a couple of different pieces to that. The first that I'd want to talk about is looking at a program and a mission lifecycle. And so when we think about a program, it's not, well, first I do requirements, completely devoid of looking downstream, completely detached from reality. And then later, I go and do a design and I look at the requirements, but only the ones that were allocated to me. And then I throw that over the fence and I build a thing and I say, okay, well, someone else needs to go integrate it. And then the person who's putting it together has no idea what they're doing because they don't understand what's happened up to this point. There's no framework that they can follow. And then we give it to the verification folks, and those poor people are at the far end of holding the bag. So it's like a whisper down the lane or a telephone game of what do we actually need? We don't simplify the requirements at the beginning. We don't follow these basic sets of kind of core tenets that help us put together requirements that are understandable, that are atomic, that are simplistic, that are verifiable. We don't do it. We don't enforce that up front. And so then we get to pay for that for the rest of the program. We get to pay for that all the way through the life cycle. That doesn't need to happen. And one of the things that I really would love to see is more folks standardizing this, because a lot of people know or have already shown in certain areas, hey, we can do this a certain way and it helps us. But it needs to be enforced. It needs to have somebody leading that charge. It needs to have a requirements management team or person or someone in the leadership group who's championing that to make it happen. So when we're talking about the requirements lifecycle, we need to accommodate not just the words we're using to write these requirements or these use cases or these user stories. It's not just right now. It's how do the needs fit into the design and development? How do the needs fit into integration? How do they fit into test? How do they fit into verification? How do they fit into operations? These are things that we can absolutely address, and we can implement the requirements in a way that helps future us. People will tell us, everyone always says requirements are hard or verification is always painful. But the reality is, if we do our job well, people who haven't done this before wonder why other people say this is hard. This has been a challenge. It's difficult to progress through the life cycle. If we do our job well, people will ask, why do these other people keep saying this is so hard? When we do our job well, we get to smile at the end of the day and shrug at those questions. We get to say things like, I don't know why other folks say this is hard. I think we've done a great job at it. But that's a really strange way of looking at it retroactively. So I recognize that you need to have people who are supporting that effort, who understand at the end of the day, if we do our job well, it's going to look like this wasn't that hard. And it's not that it's not hard, it is that it takes some forethought. And it is hard, but it's hard to be organized in a way that is valuable. It's hard to be thinking about all of the things downstream that are going to happen and take them into account early. And sometimes you need some folks who may have gone through that life cycle. So, I wanted to make sure that we started from that foundational piece. And I wanted to kind of call out that there's a little bit of perversity here. Engineers like to solve problems in this largely individualized way. It's one of the things engineers are really good at. It's, oh man, I've got this great problem and I'm going to go and work at it and I'm going to worry it and I'm going to just wear it down until I solve it. But we also like to generally create these big constructs that accommodate every single nuance that could possibly be thrown at us. And what I'm going to propose is that we don't really, that doesn't really solve our problem. We don't want to go that route. What we really want to be trying to do is simplify everything. We want to streamline things. We want to ask, what can we remove? Not, what do we need to add to accommodate one more uniqueness? One of the things that I've seen a lot is we start from this kernel, and then someone says, oh, but what about this one thing? Okay, well, then we add a little piece over here. And what about this other one thing? Oh, well, we add another piece over here. And all of that is okay. It really is, that's okay. But what the question we should be asking ourselves is, well, are any of these things, we've called out a specific instance, are they generic? Is this a generic thing that we can accommodate? And if it is, we don't need to call out the one unique thing and this other unique thing and this other unique thing. We can just do the underlying generic thing, and we've simplified our requirement space. We've simplified our design and development teams' work. We've simplified our integration and test teams and verification teams' work. We've simplified our operations. Simplification saves you money. It saves you time. And I would argue most of the time doesn't actually cost you capability. It's just a framing question. So that's where we really want to try and start from this first principles perspective of what's the simplest thing I can do to get the job done? How do I frame the problem in a way that helps me simplify my solution space? That doesn't mean I have to give someone a less capable end product. It just means that rather than saying, well, when I'm on the ground, I have to do this one thing. And then on the launch pad, I have to do this other one thing. And then when I'm during ascent, I have to do this other one thing. And then when I get just off the launch pad, I have to do this other one thing. Think about thermal. Thermal's a great example of this. There are enveloping thermal conditions that we can just say, wait, we have to accommodate this. And we can put the bounding box in place one time. Occasionally, you've got enough of a diversity in your environment that, okay, well, I need to have one for the ground and one for in space. That's okay. But,
Hey,
yeah, go ahead.
sorry to interrupt, Brian, but it looks like we have a question. And I wanted to mention to the audience, Brian and I had spoken beforehand. And we think the best way to do this is for you to just raise your hands. We'll invite you to the stage to ask your question. Or if you're feeling camera or microphone shy today, totally put them in the chat as they come up. So here we go. We got Johnny here.
I was muted. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Gotcha.
Great. Loving this so far. Thanks. James, try to cut in. Would you like me to can I ask my question or should I wait?
Oh no, ask your question, and then I'll disinvite you so you can't cut in.
Sounds good. Yeah, Brian, thank you for this. This is awesome. As you're talking, I'm thinking about incentive structures. Like what do you think is wrong with the incentive structures in these organizations or misaligned in these organizations that cause these problems?
Interesting. So I think, let me ask you a question in response just to get a little more context. When you say, what do I think is wrong with incentive structures, are you presuming then that we're not incentivizing teams to do this in this way?
Yeah, I think I always come from the point of view of like, show me the incentive and I'll show you the outcome.
Okay.
And so when the outcomes are off base of where we want them to be, I always ask myself, are we incentivizing? What are we ultimately incentivizing? And is it serving the greater picture? So I'm wondering if you think about that differently, if you agree with that, and how that kind of ties into what you've seen in your experience.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. I do generally frame it a little differently internally. So give me a second. I'm kind of thinking through your question a little bit. But I think what I've seen to help answer that question, I've seen a lot of programs bring relatively inexperienced engineers and say, oh, well, you do the requirements. It's someone who generally hasn't done the life cycle. It's someone who generally, a lot of times, hasn't even worked requirements in the past. And so we bring people in that don't really have directionality or this philosophy embedded in their soul the way it is in mine at this point. But then we don't train them. We don't point them to the best practices. We don't point them to the documentation that we have. We don't, in some cases, have that documentation. So we just throw them to the wolves, and their incentive is, hey, I need you to get the requirements done in this, insert some random amount of time. They don't define done. They don't necessarily tell them what is a good requirement in some cases. So we put people in a position where they literally can't possibly, in a process-driven way, be successful. They may get lucky, but generally that's not what I've seen. Generally what I've seen is they do this in a way that is the best that they know how, and they're not doing anything. There's no malice here. There's no one doing anything like purposefully wrong. They just don't have exposure to see downstream far enough to know how do they help themselves in the future. Does that help at all?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. I mean, I think we could talk a lot about that. I think that's at least from what I've seen, that's a significant concern. I don't generally think of it from the incentive structure perspective, but I think that's interesting. I do think generally the incentive structure is much more focused on time. I need a thing by this amount of time, and I'm going to call it good if you deliver a thing. It's not the right thing, because a lot of times people don't spend a lot of time. The people that are receiving those requirements, who are asking someone to get them done in that period of time, they're not the ultimate receivers that have to go act on those requirements. They're a group of people that are in a leadership position who may not understand the nuance that goes into it, or may not understand that spending that time up front to do this in a way that is helpful, even if it takes a little bit longer, is a massive time and cost saver over the life cycle of the program. And that to me is the part that gets missed, because I can take anybody and we can sit down and spend a few days talking through, here's the philosophy we're going to follow, and then here's the framework I want to wrap around that, and then here's how we're going to use that to influence what we're doing from a requirements development perspective. And then here's what that looks like, not just today, but here are the pieces that we care about over the life cycle. Let's start capturing those now and maturing those now so that we save all this time through the life cycle of the design and development team doesn't have to come back and ask questions and try and swirl because they don't understand what's going on. We don't spend a ton of time with large groups of people in control boards going through change management. That takes time and effort from a large number of people. And yeah, exactly what you wrote in the chat. It's slowing down to speed up. It's taking a moment up front to think about the life cycle. So if you have a group of people, even if it's a small subset, that has life cycle experience, leverage that. Ask those people. We can pull in the integration team. We can pull in the test team. We can pull in the verification folks at the beginning, express our philosophy, show them the framework, show them how that has informed what we're doing from a requirements perspective, and then get their feedback and incorporate it. Because I've seen this a lot. That doesn't mean I know everything. It means I know enough to start us, but I want to leverage the collective strengths of the team to make this easier. I say this a lot. I want to make it easier for future us. My job isn't get through the thing in front of me today as fast as possible. My job is make future us have an easier time, because that's where you end up saving cost. It's where you end up saving schedule. And that's what I'm looking to try and do as much as possible here. The side effect, it's almost funny, the side effect of saving time and saving cost is producing a better quality product as well, in this case, which is wild, right? I have less churn, I have less swirl, I have less rework, I have less kludges, so I end up with a better product. That is not something that you can say often where, well, this is going to save us time, and it's going to save us money, and it's going to increase your quality. That's like the triumvirate of goodness. It doesn't happen. This is one of those few cases where you can point to it and you say, yeah, this is going to make it better on all of those fronts. So I'm excited. I'm excited to kind of get that out into the world more, to get more folks paying attention to this, to have more folks that are doing this not only in a consistent way, but in a way that's value add for future us, the program, whatever that looks like. And I see, Matt, you're typing, so I will wait for that question. I guess in the meantime, Johnny, did you have anything else at follow up there before we move forward?
No, that was great. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Johnny.
Yeah, thanks. All right, so Matt, I see you're typing. I'm going to keep moving, and I'll see that when you... Oh, there you go. So I'll just read that for the group. How do you help affect some of this change from more of a line engineer standpoint as the poor system engineer brought onto a program without any of the documents or best practices you mentioned? Yeah, so really good question, Matt. And we've all been there, right? We've all been in that position where it's someone's brought onto a program, we're brought onto a program, and we're just thrown at it. There is no documentation. There are no best practices. So in that case, the first thing that I would do, which may be different than some other folks, for me, I'm starting to write stuff down. I'm saying, hey, here's my philosophy. Here's how I'm going to think about this. And then once I have that, I'm going to say, and here's my framework. And that's going to incorporate not just how I take my philosophy and I turn it into actionable events, but it's going to capture, here's my requirements management tool. Here's how I interface with that. Here's how I'm interfacing with the rest of the program. So that's my CM team. That's all of my downstream folks. It's when and how I'm getting their input. And I write those things down just as my first activity. So if my first activity is, gosh, I'm going to write down how we're doing this. Now, when someone says, well, what's the plan? Oops, I already wrote that down. It's right over here. Isn't that something? Having a plan, it sounds wild. we don't do that enough. And it's that Johnny said it, I think, best in the comments. It's slowing down to speed up. Am I going to read the set of customer requirements as fast? No, because I'm spending some time up front before I read those to write down what we're doing. I recognize that someone who maybe hasn't done this before isn't going to have the depth of understanding of how they want this to work. So kind of as a corollary, I said what I would do. If you're a less experienced person, you haven't done this before, reach out to the more experienced people and just ask questions. Hey, what have you seen that worked really well in requirements space in the past? I want to just write some notes. Just go ask people. When you're having the conversation about, hey, we need you to deliver a spec. Cool. What do you need? What are the base elements of that spec? Do we understand that? Do we know what the target is? Because a lot of times I've seen people deliver specs and they don't have the base elements of normal requirements. So they've delivered a thing, but it doesn't actually accommodate a good portion of the future program's needs. And then we have this churn. It's just this cyclical, okay, well, now I have to go back and ask more people about more things. I could have just accommodated that up front if I had known. We're trying to eliminate that rework. We're trying to eliminate that churn and that swirl of, oh, I didn't write my rationale and this requirement doesn't actually make a ton of sense to me right now, or the way that we're looking at it, I'm not sure it's correct, but I don't know why we have it in the first place because I didn't capture rationale for it. Oops. That's really hard. Similarly, I get to verification. Oh, I didn't write down how I plan to verify it. Well, okay, now what? I'm in verification, or I'm trying to do verification planning. Now I have to go back to people and have that conversation again. If I do that up front, I can fit all of my verifications into appropriate buckets. And so if I already have an analysis that does X, Y, and Z, maybe I slot A in there too. But if I don't know that when I'm writing the analysis, shoot, now where does A go? Do I have to write another piece of something? Do I have to go open up an old analysis and rerun it? I'm spending time, I'm spending money that I could have spent troubleshooting a real technical issue. Let's try to help ourselves with that. So, I don't know, Matt, does that help address some of that question? And I realize you can't speak right now, but yeah, just if you have follow-up or any kind of, okay, so if that's helpful, that's great. I think there's lots of nuance to that, and I'd be happy to talk about that in more detail. Either later, we're going to move to a table after the chat, or when I'm kind of done with my expected notes that I had for this. We might have some time. We can go through some more question and answer. But please keep typing questions. Keep hopping and raising your hand, and we'll answer things as they come up. But in the meantime, let me get back to kind of the next piece that I wanted to make sure we touched on. And so what we were talking about is simplification. And one of the things that I guess is interesting to me that came up recently, and I was talking to another engineer about, how do we justify all this work? We're spending time and money on requirements. We're saying, gosh, this is important. We need to go do the thing. But why? Requirements aren't the product. They're an interloper. They're a questionably necessary set of extraneous work, right? They're not the thing that my customer asked for. My customer wants a tangible thing, whether it's a piece of hardware or software or both. That's what they want. Why are we spending all this time and energy on requirements? We spend so much time and energy on them. And one of the things that came to mind for me, and I wanted to share this because I think this is a potentially helpful way of looking at it. A long time ago in the automotive industry, Henry Ford said, gosh, I wonder what would happen if I had a whole bunch of people on an assembly line and I could build vehicles that way rather than every single vehicle being a one-off. Well, okay, great, cool idea. We know how that's worked out, but how much money gets spent on the assembly line? How much money gets spent on training the people on the assembly line? How much money gets spent on putting together the robotics on the assembly line? How much money gets spent on setting up a building that supports an assembly line? All of that isn't money that goes to making the product directly. But all of that is money that helps make the product more quickly, more efficiently, with higher quality. And the automotive industry has spent 100 years on this at this point, refining it. And now you don't find anyone in the automotive industry that's building any appreciable number of vehicles without an assembly line. They understand how to do this. I would put requirements kind of in the same bucket. They're not the thing itself. It's an enabling technology. It's a tool. And that kind of goes back to what I was saying at the beginning. Requirements are a tool. Let's use them that way. Let's make our lives easier by using our tools in an appropriate way so that they help us. So how do we do that? How do we help ourselves using this tool in a way that enables us to do our job more efficiently? I think there's a whole bunch of things that fall out for me. I think we establish these foundational approaches by leveraging lessons we've learned, best practices we've seen. Obviously, to Matt's point, you sometimes get folks who don't have that experience that are put into this position. That's okay. Let's help those folks by encouraging them to take a moment, take a breath, ask some questions, write some stuff down. Let's come up with an approach that makes sense. We can lean on the folks that have done this before, or barring that, who've had life cycle experience before. Hey, tell me what happens when we get to integration. Tell me what happens when I do verification. What things have you seen that have been hard? What things have you seen that slow us down or break us? Let's accommodate those now. That's not that hard to do if we're in that mindset, if we're paying attention up front, if we're functionally thinking about how do I make future us have a better, easier, more effective time. That's what we're trying to get to. We want to involve our teammates from the entirety of the life cycle. We want to ask for that input, for that feedback about the philosophy and the framework that we put together. We want to write all these things down so we can point to a single location of truth for the approach. We want to get our team moving in the same direction. We want to have that approach inform not just writing the requirements, but we want it to inform our interactions with customers, with vendors, with teammates, with our management. All of these are things that are useful. All of these are things that we need to go and do in some way. Why don't we do it in a consistent way? Why don't we write it down? Why don't we say, here's what we're going to go do? Why don't we think through that up front? I think that's the part that, to me, would be really, really helpful. We want to reiterate to not just ourselves and the system engineering organizations, but we want to reiterate this to the program, to our customers, to our vendors. There's an importance to following our philosophy, using our framework. It allows us to move in a consistent direction. It allows us to prevent misunderstanding, or at least greatly minimize misunderstanding. We want to leverage our documentation to help our new teammates. We want to, whether they're new to engineering or new to aerospace. Aerospace is an example of this, but this isn't unique to aerospace. This happens in lots of different industries. So when we have someone coming from a different industry, or we have someone coming from a different program, or we have someone coming from a different organization, let's help them get up to speed and understand we're all running in this direction. Let's run together. We avoid one-off situations. When we look at any particular challenge, we use our framework as a tool to simplify the solution space. So it's not, oh, well, this new, completely different thing came up. Let's come up with a one-off solution for it. We shouldn't be doing that. We should be saying, here's how we choose to approach these things. And so in that mindset, with this framework that we've documented, this is what we're going to go do here. Finally, on that front, we address our customers early and often to ensure we're building the thing they need. That doesn't mean I go to NASA and say, NASA, this, because sometimes I'm talking about requirements for a subsystem. So sometimes if I'm talking about subsystem level requirements, I should be talking to my system team. Hey guys, I see this. I'm trying to accommodate it. How do you feel this will work with the rest of what the team is doing? Aerospace loves to stovepipe itself. Stovepipes are fine as long as there's somebody who's paying attention at the top and making sure that those stovepipes are pointed in the right direction, that they connect when and where they need to. That's part of what system engineering really is. And requirements engineering, or requirements in general, is kind of, again, it's a symptom of good system engineering or bad system engineering. If we're good at it and we're paying attention, the requirements help to enable us, and they help to foster these conversations. That's what we want. So I think in general, we could talk for days, couple of days, 2, 3, 4 days, about all of these particulars. We can do that. We have requirements training currently on offer. This isn't a sales pitch, but there's a few basic core things that we could go do, and if we're all doing it, it helps us. We have some interesting things that are happening in the industry where we've got some programs that have, some of the large programs, some of them I've worked, have kind of gotten to a point where they've gone way down the downstream or down the programmatic life cycle, and they haven't done what we've just discussed over the last 35 minutes. They've treated everything as a one-off. And so what ends up happening is there's no documentation, and everyone just kind of does what they think is best at the time, but there's no leadership. There's no directionality to what they're doing. It's thrashy. Some of those large programs have employed dozens or hundreds of people in these types of roles. A lot of those people have spread across the industry. And so now we've got people who say they've got this experience, and they do, but they have experience or they've only worked on one program and it's done it poorly. This is aiming, this mindset, this approach is aiming to help combat that. And so we can talk for, like I said, days about this, but I think if you can leave this particular discussion with a few main takeaways, it's simplify. It's document your approach. It's be flexible early in your process. It's keeping your life cycle in mind. It's, understanding it's a marathon. It's not a sprint. So let's think about it that way. We're not trying to deliver the thing for the next milestone. We're trying to deliver the thing for the next milestone that will also accommodate the rest of the life cycle. I think above all else, it's the whole idea of help future us, even if it sometimes comes at a small cost to current us. And I think that, to me, is the biggest takeaway from all of this. We need to be thinking about requirements and system engineering as a whole as a way to enable success over the life cycle, not as a point solution. So that's kind of what I had prepared for us for today. I'm certainly happy to talk if there's any specific questions, you want to dive into any specific, any particulars on any of this. There's tons and tons of things we could talk about. I think there's lots of examples. If there's specific questions, let's start with those. Otherwise, I have a couple of examples that I could go through if that would be helpful.
Thanks for the TED Talk portion that you were trying to avoid. I think you did a pretty good job, so I appreciate that. I mean, like, I had some basic questions that I think would be useful for the crowd, or if anyone watches this after the fact. What is a requirement? What isn't a requirement? And then there's follow-ons from there.
Yeah. So we could certainly talk through that for a few hours if we wanted to. What is a requirement? So there's lots of different acronyms you could use as reminders of the things you care about. SMART is one of my favorites. It's specific, measurable, actionable, realistic, and timely. And so there's a whole bunch of things there. You want your requirements to be simple. You want them to be atomic. You need requirements that aren't, I'm going to do this and this and this and this and this and this. You want requirements that are pointing to, I'm going to do this one thing. if I have to restrict when I'm doing the one thing, great, I can capture that as part of the requirement. But in general, you want to capture a function, you want to capture a level of performance that needs to be met, you want to capture an interface. Those are basically the things you're going to care about in requirement space. Because if I'm asking someone to build me something, well, I needed to do a certain set of things. I needed to do a certain set of things at a certain level of performance, and it needs to talk or interface or mount to this other thing. That's it. Anything beyond that, while it may be important, requirements, ConOps are not requirements. Design reference missions are not requirements. A reference to a standard is not a requirement. People miss that a lot. I see a ton of requirements in a lot of different organizations that says, shall comply with document X. That's not a requirement. It doesn't mean anything. There's, in almost every one of those cases, when you pull up document X, it's a 200-page thing. Some of it has very specific language. Some of it is flowery word salad. Some of it is referencing other documents. Well, now what? Do I have to meet those other documents too? That's not helpful. So when we talk about what is a requirement versus what isn't a requirement, I've seen people try and make the argument that, well, in this case, our customer wants us to do a thing. So yeah, they gave us this requirement and it's like 2 paragraphs long, but we're just going to accept it as is. Nope. We don't want to do that. What we want to do is go back to our customer and have a conversation. Hey, we want to make sure we're building you the thing that you want. I think this 2 paragraph thing actually is 12 different requirements, but I wanted to go through that with you. There's very few times where I've found someone is unwilling to talk about the situation at hand from a requirements perspective, because in general, people understand the requirements are that formality between the 2 different stakeholders. If there's confusion there, that doesn't serve anyone. And so generally what I found is I reach out, I say, hey, I look through the requirement space. There's a bunch of really good stuff in here that I understand really well. There's a handful of things that I just have a couple of minor clarifications that I want to make sure I capture, so I have them documented. And then there's these 5 or 10 or 15 or however many that I just don't understand and I really want your help. When you go to a customer or any engineer in this case and you say, help me, I really don't understand what you asked. As an engineer, you're like, oh, they don't let me explain it to them. And engineers get excited. They want to explain stuff to people. So take advantage of that. And I don't mean that in a predatory way. I mean, take advantage of making sure that there's clean understanding between 2 groups. And that's where having a conversation is amazingly valuable. Some of the time, you can do that over a phone call. Some of the time, a video chat's better. Some of the time, it really is helpful to go and fly out to your customer, or the next time you're out there, or next time they come to visit, sit down with them in a room, face to face. Hey, help me understand this. I want to make sure we're delivering to you the product that you need. And that is something that, honestly, I haven't seen enough of. It's surprising to me, but I've seen a lot of organizations where they say, well, the customer gave us these, so we have to do this. And I say, okay. And I start looking and I start flagging stuff and I start writing questions. And I say, I'm going to go talk to the customer about this. And they're like, no, don't do that. Just do what it says. Oh, well, come over here. Help me, because maybe you can help me. I'm not sure I understand this. And you start going through it. Show them. Well, what do you think this means? What do you think this means? How do you think we do this? And usually, not always, but usually, if people are being reasonable, they'll say, oh, I didn't realize that that's what they had sent us. I can't tell you how many times I've seen that, where I sit down, I go through it, I pull up all the things that are questionable, and I get pushback when I want to go and sit down with our customer interface. And I say, oh, okay, well, come over, let's talk about it. And I start going through it, and after I get to the 3rd one, they're like, yeah, just go talk to the customer. Okay, thank you. Have a great day. That's fine. It's okay to have that interface. It's okay to do your due diligence. and not just say, like, oh, I'm sure someone else will understand what this means. Well, I think this is for an avionics guy, so the avionics folks will figure it out. Don't fall into that trap. If you, as a normal human being, cannot understand what the requirement is trying to get you to do, or what the product has to do from a performance or functional perspective, the people downstream won't know either. If there's no rationale for the requirement, the people downstream aren't going to be able to understand that either. And sometimes things that are pretty straightforward, when I go back to customers, their rationale is totally different than what I thought it was going to be. Where they surprise me with something, sometimes it's way stricter, it's way harder to achieve because their rationale is, I really need this to do this one little piece because I'm trying to achieve this crazy thing over here. Well, shoot, just tell me about the crazy thing. Don't tell me about the piece part thing. There's ways to simplify this rather than, try and treat it as a one-off. I literally had a customer give a requirement that was, you shall use part number X when you're assembling your vehicle. And I said, well, why? Well, because we know that part number meets the needs of what the interface is going to go do. Okay, well, tell me what the interface is, and maybe tell me that that's the part number that you've used in the past, and that's great. But the requirement isn't to use that part. The requirement is to meet the interface need. So tell me that. And having that conversation can sometimes be a little bit more interesting. It can make folks a little bit less comfortable. Customers sometimes don't understand that if the way they look at it is they've done the work for you. Oh, we've already figured it out. Use this. But sometimes that doesn't actually make it easier. Sometimes it makes it harder. Sometimes it makes it more expensive. Sometimes there's a long lead on that part, and there's another part available that would do the same job. Tell me what the thing has to do. Don't tell me how to get there, right? And so that's another really important piece of requirements is the requirements should be, what do I have to do, not how do I have to do it? That's really, really, really important to keep in mind because that is a gross simplification in the requirement space on a lot of missions. So I think I talked a little bit, James. I mean, again, we could talk for days on this. I could go through attributes, right? You need to have a rationale. You need to have a location for the actual requirement. You can talk about what level you want things to be put in, where you've got a customer gives you a set of requirements. Those get kind of spread to different levels based on the actual fidelity of the requirement. You might have something that's a mission level thing. You might have something that's a system level thing. You might have something that's a component level thing. That's not necessarily bad. See you, Matt. Thanks for joining. Thanks for your question too. That's not necessarily bad. If a customer says, hey, I know I need a part to do a specific thing for some reason, okay, that's not the end of the world. We should accommodate that if that's what the customer needs. But we should be able to understand that, and we should have a framework that allows us to support, hey, they gave me some things, some of them are mission, some of them are subsystem. Let's put them where they belong, and then let's track to those. Similarly, when I'm tracking across the life cycle, if I have system level requirements and I can decompose them, which a lot of the time I do, right? If I can decompose things down to subsystems, the goal should be to fully decompose, at least from the level where you are to the next level down. If I then verify all the things at the next level down, I have verified that requirement. If it is fully decomposed and I've done all the things, it's done. I don't need to track verification at every single level if I've already got full decomposition. I can say, hey, yeah, I'm planning to do system level testing, but that's validation testing, not verification. And that's okay. And we need to be really clear about the difference there. That's another topic for another day. But there's so many ways that you can kind of talk through the particulars here in a value add way. I think, we talked about rationale, we talked about location. Requirements should have owners. There should be a person responsible for each requirement. Now, that person doesn't have to be necessarily the person who's an expert on all things that requirement, but they should be the person that's responsible for shepherding that requirement through the process. That means the decomposition. That means making sure that there is whatever verification is necessary. There's lots of different pieces to this that all need to be accommodated. So let's accommodate them. And sometimes it's not necessarily that people don't want to do that. It's the fact that it hasn't been put into the roles and responsibilities, so they don't know that they're expected to go do that. I think some of the other things, traceability, where is this requirement from? Is it a customer decomposition? Is it something that we are self-imposing because we know from previous programs that we need to go do this and we want to track it formally because it's that important? That's fine. We can go do that. We should be tracking verification information at the requirements level. It is not a separate task where you say, here's my set of requirements. Okay, verification team, you go figure out how you're going to go verify them. That is not the thing. The thing is, hey, verification team, come over here and help me. We wrote these requirements. I want to make sure that you can understand what we're doing, what we're trying to accomplish. We also wanted to capture what's the verification method. So that's your standard, analysis, inspection, demonstration, test, roll-up. Most people forget the roll-up. Don't forget the roll-up. It's a super easy thing to just say, hey, I fully decomposed this. I'm going to verify it by roll-up. I'm not going to do anything at this level with this requirement particularly. That's a good thing. That's what you want. Right? Take advantage of the fact that you've done the decomposition work. Don't duplicate all the work that you've done in the verification space. But then, what's the verification activity? What's the verification event? What are the things that I'm going to do? So if I said, okay, the approach is going to be analysis. Awesome. That's great. So what's the verification activity? Well, it's this analysis. I'm going to do a thermal analysis in this environment. Super. Write that down. What's the verification event? What's the step within that analysis or the section within that analysis that's going to buy off the requirement? Write that down. And then when you're going through to, I'm going to go and start writing these analyses, I'm going to start planning these tests, I'm going to start doing these inspections, you pull up the one place where you've captured that activity, right? That you've said, okay, this is the activity. You've got links to all the requirements that you're planning to buy off with it, or partially buy off, because you can have multiple verifications for a single requirement if necessary. And now I've not only said, okay, well, here's what I'm going to go, here's the thing I'm going to go do, here's the step within the thing. Tell people. Because when the person goes to write the analysis, when the person goes to design the test, make their life easy. You've already done the work. You've already had to think about it. Don't make them come chase you down and try and figure it out, and then try to dredge up your memory of what you thought you were going to go do 6 months ago or 12 months ago. Write it down. It's not hard. And these are standard attributes that you can push into your requirements management tooling, whatever that looks like, regardless of whether it's doors or JAMA or you're using use cases, or it doesn't matter. It's all stuff that you can write down in whatever tool you decide to use. Tooling is a totally different topic that we should also talk at some point, but the tooling should be, again, set up to help this process within this framework. I keep coming back to that because if you're thinking about this in a consistent way, everything falls into that. And that's what you want. You want your process to follow a consistent approach that follows this philosophy, which you build a framework around, which now enables all of your downstream work to be done in a more efficient way, in a higher quality way. So all of that is really important. All of that is really interesting. I realized that we are just a couple minutes left, so I wanted to make sure if there's other questions that I get a chance to answer those as well.
All right. Feel free to interrupt me if a question is percolating to the top, but otherwise I'm going to read us out here. Brian, that was awesome. Thank you for discussing, well, having another one of our discussions just on the camera this time. No, I think this is really valuable insight. Not a lot of people get spend as much time thinking about requirements and the downstream effects, and I think a lot of people, I think everyone on this call has participated in a program where they're an afterthought. and where they're being ignored and nobody knows what's going on. So knowing that you're out there as a resource, if they need help, or or that there's training available, or that there are ways to think about this beyond just, oh well, this is what this person says, and we're going to get it done that way, I think is really invaluable. So that's what I hope Space Underground does. I think even in the future, if if somebody has a question about requirements, and you can't answer it, maybe ping Brian. As a stand-in, you could ping me. I have some thoughts and feelings that are mostly aligned with Brian's on the subject, and I think we could leave it there. Next week, Mike Holmes is going to talk about electric propulsion in his capacity of 40 years at AFRL in their doing EP, teaching plasma physics at the teaching plasma physics, performing plasma physics, seeing all the interesting industry items that sometimes were stillborn, sometimes have flown. And he could tell us all about kind of what's been going on with that while he was there. Mike is now currently the director of propulsion at EOI Space, just for reference. And it looks like we got good discussion. And thank yous. All right. Thank you, everyone, for attending. We're going to head over to the tables, table 1, I guess. If there's overflow, head to table 2, and Brian will be sure to bounce between the two. All right. Thanks.